He had walked through airports 1,000 times, but never had one stopped him like this. Seattle International buzzed with its usual Monday morning chaos. Suitcases rolling, coffee orders shouted, families reuniting, lives colliding in a blur of arrivals and departures. Ethan Callahan, 39, moved through it all like a shadow in a tailored gray suit. Every inch of him said power. CEO of a luxury restaurant empire, master of boardrooms and billion-dollar deals. His watch cost more than most people's rent. His time? Priceless. But time stopped the moment he saw her. She lay on the cold tile floor near Gate B17, head resting against a worn backpack. A thin blanket covered 2 sleeping toddlers curled up on her chest. No stroller. No luggage. Just her, the boys, and exhaustion. Her coat was too light for fall, sneakers frayed, hair messy in a way that had nothing to do with fashion. Still, there was something about her presence, quiet, unbothered by the crowd, that unsettled him. Then she moved, just slightly, enough for her hair to shift, revealing a face he hadn't seen in 2 years. Eyes the color of a stormy sea. Blue-gray, deep and wounded. Sophie. The name hit him like a memory with sharp edges. She had once worked for his family. Quiet, kind, a background presence who dusted books in the library and vanished before you noticed she'd ever been there. Until the day his mother came home early. Until the accusations. Until Sophie stood frozen in fear, and Ethan, her supposed protector, had said nothing. Now here she was, on an airport floor, with 2 boys who looked far too familiar. He didn't remember walking toward her. He just moved. She opened her eyes as he approached. Recognition flared instantly. Her arms curled protectively around the children, her whole body tightening. A mother's instinct. But her eyes stayed calm. Too calm. "It's really you," Ethan said, his voice low and strained, like it had to be pulled up from a place he hadn't touched in years. She didn't smile, didn't flinch. "Mr. Callahan." That name used to come with reverence. Now it was armor. "I didn't expect to see you here," he murmured. Small talk was useless, but he had no script for this. No one ever does. The twins shifted beneath the blanket. Ethan's gaze lingered on them. 2 small, peaceful faces, breathing in sync. "How old are they?" he asked, heart thudding. 20 months. His breath caught. "Mine." The word didn't come. He didn't need to ask. "They look like you," she said, her voice cool, almost clinical. He sat, careful to keep space between them. Not too close. "Not yet. Why didn't you tell me?" She gave a short laugh, but it wasn't humor. "Tell you? When your mother threw me out like trash, and you stood there like a statue." He winced. No defense came to his lips. "I'm sorry," he whispered. It sounded pathetic. Small. But it was the truth. Sophie looked down at one of the boys, brushing his hair back with a tenderness that didn't need words. Ethan couldn't stop staring. These were his sons. His blood. And yet, strangers. "I want to help," he said. "Please. Let me do something." She looked at him, really looked, and then said quietly, "You already did. With your silence." That was the end of their first conversation, but not the end of the story. In the days that followed, Ethan couldn't unsee her. Her curled frame on that airport floor haunted him. The way she held those boys, his boys, tight to her chest. Not begging, not accusing, just surviving. He tried to find her. She'd vanished again, like smoke. Then he remembered something. A return address on a package she once received. A place called Atoria, Oregon. Tiny. Coastal. Not the kind of place a Callahan ever went. But he went. He canceled meetings. Ignored calls. Hopped on a plane and drove a dented rental Jeep down roads that curled like secrets along the Pacific. Atoria was quiet. Seagulls, salt wind, crooked cottages, and weathered porches. No stock tickers. No espresso bars. Just life. Slower, heavier. He checked into a modest inn, Coastal Rest. The name rang a bell. "You're far from home," the innkeeper said as she handed him a rusted key. "I'm looking for someone," Ethan replied. He didn't say her name. He didn't need to. The next morning, as the fog lifted from the hills, Ethan saw them. Sophie, in a faded shirt and jeans, walking along the garden path behind a nearby cottage. The twins, Liam and Chris, he would learn, raced ahead, laughing. She hadn't seen him yet. He stepped forward. "Sophie." She froze mid-step. The world paused. Then she turned. "What are you doing here?" Her voice wasn't angry, just tired. "I couldn't forget. I had to find you. Find them. She didn't answer right away. Just looked at him with disbelief. You left everything behind. I lost you once, he said. I'm not letting it happen again. That's when Liam wandered over. The boy looked up at Ethan, curious. Ethan knelt slowly. Hey, buddy. Tiny fingers reached out, hesitated, then rested in Ethan's hand. In that moment, Ethan knew. This wasn't a reunion. It was a beginning. That night, Ethan walked the shoreline alone. The sea was dark, rhythmic, indifferent. He barely heard the old man approach until a quiet voice broke the silence. You're not from around here. Ethan turned to find a fisherman mending a net, his face worn by sun and wisdom. What gave me away? Ethan asked. The man smiled. Your shoes. No one wears leather loafers to the beach. They sat in silence for a while. Came for a woman, didn't you? The man asked. Ethan nodded. I lost her, he said. Trying to fix that. The old man didn't offer advice. Just kept working his net. The sea teaches patience, he finally said. Biggest catch never comes easy. Ethan looked at the tangled ropes in his hands. The old man, weathered and calm, felt more like a prophet than a fisherman. And for the first time, Ethan realized this wasn't about reclaiming something. It was about learning how to build it from nothing. The sea did not care who you were. It did not bow to titles, nor did it soften for suits. It welcomed everyone the same way, roughly, honestly. It stripped you of everything you wore to feel important and asked only one thing in return: show up. Or go home. Ethan Callahan showed up. He didn't know how to be a fisherman. He didn't even know how to dress like one. The first morning he arrived at the docks, he wore boat shoes that still smelled like department store leather and a waterproof jacket that had never seen real weather. By noon, he had fallen into the water twice, thrown up once, and lost his footing more times than he could count. Mr. Jones, the old man with calloused hands and patient eyes, handed him a new pair of boots the next morning without saying a word. Just gave him a look. One that said, you're not of the sea, but you're trying like a man who wants to be. Ethan didn't argue. He wore the boots. Each dawn, he rose before the sun, hands already sore, eyes burning with salt. He coiled ropes, hauled nets, gutted fish. Everything smelled like the ocean and blood, and by the time the sun touched the water, his muscles ached with a pain so deep it felt like something sacred. But he came back, every day, and slowly, painfully, something in him shifted. Gone was the CEO who sat at gleaming conference tables and spoke in percentages. In his place stood a man with burned palms and sun-stung skin, learning to live without control, without comfort, without image. In the afternoons, he helped Linda around the inn, fixed the leaky roof, repaired an old fence, painted rooms that hadn't seen color in years. He dried dishes next to a woman he'd only just met, and when she finally asked, "You doing all this for Sophie?" He didn't hesitate. "Not just for her," he said. "For me, too." Linda just nodded, not prying further. Some truths were better left standing quietly between two people, like tide-washed stones on a beach. Each evening, Ethan stood at the edge of the garden fence behind Sophie's cottage. He never crossed it. Not once. He simply stood and watched. Liam and Chris ran through the tall grass like tiny explorers, chasing bugs, tripping over wildflowers. Their laughter rose and fell like birdsong. Sometimes Sophie stepped out with a basket of laundry, her hair in a messy bun, a streak of flour on her cheek. She would see him, but never wave, and never turn away either. The silence between them changed over time. At first, it was distance. Now it felt like waiting. One afternoon, Chris tripped on a garden stone and fell hard. Sophie hadn't seen it yet, but Ethan did. He was over the fence before he could think, heart racing, feet pounding against the grass. Chris was crying, lip trembling, arms outstretched. Hey, little man," Ethan whispered, scooping him up gently. "You're okay." The boy clung to him. No resistance, no fear, just trust. When Sophie turned and saw them, she stopped mid-step. For a long moment, she said nothing, just stood there, watching. And though her lips didn't move, something in her eyes softened slightly. A crease that hadn't been there before. A breath she didn't know she was holding. She didn't scold him, didn't pull Chris away. That said more than words ever could. Later that week, Ethan heard a whisper through an open window. Liam's voice. "Mom," he said, "is that man my dad?" Sophie knelt beside him, brushing hair from his forehead. "What do you think?" Liam looked at Ethan, sitting quietly by the gate, hands in his lap. "I think he looks like me," the boy said. "And he makes me feel safe." Ethan felt something in his chest break open. No paternity test could ever mean more than that. He wasn't just chasing redemption now. He was becoming a father. One evening, as the sun melted over the horizon, Ethan sat on a log by the shore, watching the tide roll in. That's when he saw Jones again, repairing a net beside his boat. "You're still here," the old man said, not looking up. "I am. You're not running anymore." "No," Ethan said. "I think I've done enough running to last a lifetime." Jones tied another knot. "You lost someone important, didn't you?" Ethan nodded. "I let her go without a fight. I've been trying to earn her trust back ever since." Jones finally met his eyes. The sea doesn't give second chances often, but when it does, you don't waste it. Ethan looked at his own hands. Cut, scraped, tired. "I don't intend to," he said. And he meant it. But life, as always, had its own plans. The storm didn't come from the ocean. It came from San Francisco. Ethan was fixing a squeaky door hinge at the inn when his phone rang. He almost didn't answer, but he recognized the number. His former assistant. Her voice was tense, cautious. "Ethan, your mother's filed a custody suit. For the boys." He didn't understand at first. "What? Why?" "She's petitioned the Oregon court. Claims you're unfit, emotionally unstable, financially reckless. Says Sophie's an uneducated single woman with no steady income. It's aggressive." Ethan's breath caught. Of course. Margaret Callahan. She hadn't changed. She never did. To her, Sophie was still the help. The boys were heirs, Callahan blood. And the idea that they'd grow up in a beach town with muddy feet and homemade meals? Unthinkable. Ethan told Sophie that night. She sat at her tiny kitchen table, hands wrapped around a steaming cup of tea. The boys had just gone to sleep. She didn't cry, but her jaw tightened. Her fingers trembled. "I knew it," she whispered. "I knew she wouldn't stay quiet forever." He reached across the table, took her hand. "We won't let her take them," he said. "I'll fight. With everything I have." Sophie met his eyes. Her voice low. "Raw. But how? I don't have a lawyer. I don't have money. I don't even have the same last name." Ethan stood, walked around the table, and dropped to one knee on the creaky wooden floor. He didn't have a ring. Just paint-stained fingers, trembling with emotion. "Sophie Rivera," he said softly. "Will you marry me? Not for the court. Not for strategy. But because I love you. And because I want to call you family. Legally, truthfully, and forever." Sophie froze. Her eyes wide, her breath caught. Then, slowly, she nodded. Tears welled up, but didn't fall. "I do," she whispered. And it was the most sacred vow either of them had ever made. Not for appearances. Not for victory. For love. The wedding wasn't planned. It wasn't grand. And it wasn't meant to be beautiful. But somehow it was all of those things. Word of the custody suit traveled fast in Etoria. The town didn't care much for gossip. But it did care for Sophie. And now, by extension, for Ethan. The moment Linda heard the news, she stood from behind the inn's front desk like a general rising for war. "We're not letting that woman bring her money and lawyers here to tear this family apart," she said flatly, then reached for the old rotary phone. "Not in my town." She called the baker, the pastor, the local mechanic, the carpenter with 3 fingers, the gay couple who'd raised 2 orphans, and of course, Mr. Jones, who showed up with a fresh-caught halibut and said nothing, as usual, but stayed all the same. That night, they gathered at the seaside cafe. No suits, no scripts, just warm lights, sticky tables, the smell of coffee cake and salt air, and one goal: protect the people who belong to them now. "The ceremony will be out back," Linda declared, writing on a napkin like it was sacred parchment. "Behind the inn, near the wild roses." "I'll bake the cake," the baker said. "I'll build the arch from driftwood," Jones added, eyes glinting. The mechanic, who blushed every time Sophie looked his way, cleared his throat. I've got some wedding dresses my wife left behind. They might fit, if you want." Sophie smiled gently. She wanted. Ethan stood quietly among them, watching this odd assembly of townspeople, strangers who had somehow become family. He said only one thing, voice low but full. "Thank you, not just for today, but for giving me a home when I thought I had none." The next morning, the air smelled of something new. Not salt, not fish, not wet sand, but promise. The beach behind the inn was transformed. White stones framed the aisle. Linen banners fluttered in the wind like forgotten prayers. The driftwood arch stood tall, tied with sea lavender and baby's breath. No orchestra, just gulls circling above, and the quiet murmur of the tide rolling in and out like breath. Sophie stepped out in a simple white dress. No veil, no diamonds, just soft fabric, a tied-back waist, and a single sprig of lavender braided into her hair. Her eyes sparkled, not from makeup, but from what walked beside her. Liam and Chris, barefoot and grinning, held her hands as her tiny ring-bearers. Ethan waited at the end of the aisle, sleeves rolled, shoes off. No tuxedo, just a white shirt, dark slacks, and eyes locked on the only woman who'd ever undone him with silence. The pastor kept it short. No long speeches. No lectures on duty or fate. Just one question. Ethan Callahan, do you promise to love, protect, and walk beside her? Not just today, but every day from here on? I do. Simple. Steady. And Sophie Rivera, do you promise to trust, forgive, and love this man? Not just for who he was, but for who you'll become together? I do. Her voice shook, but her gaze did not. There were no rings. Just a long pause. And then their hands reached for each other, fingers finding familiar ground. When their lips finally met beneath the driftwood arch, the applause was soft but full, the kind only truth can carry. Jones stepped forward afterward, placing something into Ethan's hand. A hand-carved wooden keychain, etched into it, for the man who didn't run, and the family who waited. Ethan hugged him like a father. Sophie kissed Linda's cheek and whispered, "Thank you for believing in me, even when I didn't." Linda just smiled. Family isn't blood. It's who stands beside you when the storms hit. But the storm wasn't done with them. 2 days later, the court date arrived. No roses. No white stones. Just polished wood, fluorescent lights, and Margaret Callahan in a $4,000 suit. She didn't look angry. She looked composed. Like this was another business meeting. Another boardroom. Another war to win with paperwork and power. Her lawyers were lean, sharp-eyed, prepared. They had binders. Experts. Lists. Exhibits. Sophie wore a pale blue dress. No jewelry. Just calm eyes and fingers tightly laced with Ethan's. The judge, a gray-haired woman with sharp cheekbones, opened the hearing with a long sigh and a quiet request. No grandstanding. No shouting. Just facts. Margaret's team went first. They painted Ethan as a man who had walked away from his business, his stability, and his obligations. Said he had abandoned a structured lifestyle to pursue an unpredictable one. Claimed Sophie was financially dependent, professionally unqualified, and lacking the resources to provide for 2 minors. Then came Ethan and Sophie. No legal team, just their truth. Ethan spoke plainly about his past, his failures, his silence, but also about what he had built in Etoria, the long mornings at sea, the sweat-stained hands, the sleepless nights learning how to be a father. Sophie told her story with calm precision. The fear, the rejection, the choice to survive, not just for herself, but for the lives she carried. The boys were her strength, she said, not her burden. And then the townspeople took the stand. One by one, Jones described Ethan's first fishing trip, his vomit, his persistence, his humility. Linda spoke of Sophie's patience with the boys, her quiet strength, her refusal to give up on life, on love, on herself. The pastor described their wedding. No one fakes something that honest, he said simply. The baker talked about how Chris liked blueberry muffins and how Liam once drew a picture of his dad fixing a boat. The courtroom was silent. No exhibits. Just memories. Proof. Witnesses. The judge sat quietly for a long moment after the testimonies ended. Then she leaned forward, hands folded. This court, she said, has heard arguments from wealth and from experience, from strategy and from soul. But when it comes to children, what matters most is not appearances. It's presence. She looked directly at Margaret. And in this case, I see no reason to remove Liam and Christopher Callahan from the only environment where they've received consistent emotional care, active parental involvement, and a community that supports their well-being. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. I hereby grant full custody to their biological parents, Ethan and Sophie Callahan. Petition denied. Sophie gasped. Ethan exhaled like he hadn't in months. They turned to each other and held on. Tight. Unbreakable. Linda wiped a tear. Jones simply nodded, lips pressed together. Margaret stood, straightened her jacket, and walked out. No drama. No final words. Just the echo of her heels, clicking down the long hallway until they disappeared. She had lost. But more importantly, Sophie had won. Not just the case. Her life. Spring arrived in Etoria like a slow breath, soft, green, and full of quiet hope. It had been 1 week since the courtroom fell silent, and the judge's ruling landed like a sunrise. Ethan and Sophie had walked out that day not just as victors, not just as parents, but as something stronger, a family that had been tested by fire and walked out holding hands. They didn't throw a party. There were no toasts, no champagne. Instead, they went home and built something real. Behind the Coastal Rest Inn, on a patch of land that once grew wild with thorn and weed, Ethan began digging. He did it with the same hands that once signed mergers and acquisitions, now stained with earth, nicked by splinters, toughened by nets and nails. Sophie stood beside him, chalk in hand, sketching lines across the dirt. Her hair was pulled back, a pencil tucked behind one ear, her fingers dusty from the blueprints she designed late into the night. They were building a guest house. Not a luxury resort. Not a 5-star escape. Just 5 rooms. A home for others who needed one. Mr. Jones helped with the frame. Linda supplied old furniture and stories about where each piece had come from. The mechanic who'd once blushed at Sophie's smile handled the wiring. The baker brought muffins. Always warm. And Ethan worked from sunup to sundown. He dug every inch of the foundation with his own strength. No investors. No sponsors. Just intention. Every brick was a small act of faith. Every board a quiet answer to a question life had once asked. Can you rebuild without starting over? Turns out, yes. If you start from the heart. The guest house opened quietly in early summer. A painted sign hung from a driftwood post out front, Seabreeze Guest House. The name was Sophie's. The lettering was done by Chris, who insisted on drawing a tiny fish in the corner. Liam helped paint it sky blue. The room smelled of salt, new wood, and fresh linens. Nothing fancy, but everything clean, warm, and real. The windows caught the sunrise. The floorboards creaked like old songs. And through every open window came the laughter of children. It wasn't just a guest house. It was a sanctuary. Visitors came slowly at first, hikers, retirees, couples looking for quiet. But they didn't leave unchanged. They went fishing with Ethan, learning how to mend nets and gut snapper. They joined Sophie's cooking classes, folding fish into handmade pies, picking herbs from the back garden. The twins set the breakfast tables each morning, spilling juice more often than not, playing harmonica at sunrise, and leading guests down to the shore to hunt seashells. It was ordinary, and it was everything. Then one quiet morning in July, Sophie stepped out onto the back porch with something unreadable in her eyes. Ethan was setting breakfast trays in the kitchen when she took his hand, placed it over her stomach, and whispered just 2 words. Guess what? He froze. Blinked. His hand stayed pressed to her skin. Warm. Real. Are you? She nodded. Eyes glistening. Voice steady. We're going to have another. Ethan didn't speak at first. Just smiled. The kind of smile that couldn't be faked. A quiet one. One that came from the ribs, from the spine, from the place where regret used to live. That night, he sat on the porch and looked out at the stars. His sons were asleep. Sophie was reading inside, her silhouette soft in the lamp's glow. The breeze carried the scent of lavender and seawater. He whispered something to the wind. I never thought I'd get another chance. And then, a minute later, thank you. The following March, Benjamin Callahan was born in the same back room, where Sophie taught guests how to knead dough and pickle fish. No hospital. No bright lights. Just a midwife from the village, a warm fire, the distant sound of waves, and Ethan's hand in hers. Benjamin entered the world with a cry that sounded like laughter. Liam declared he had pirate eyes. Chris wanted to name him after a fish, but settled for being the first to hold his little brother. Sophie smiled through tears. Ethan wept without shame. They didn't take photos for the internet. They didn't announce it in magazines. They simply hung a hand-lettered sign on the door. Show. New life sleeping. Life settled into something beautiful. Morning started slow. Ethan carried Benjamin down the beach in a sling, humming softly as the sun rose. Gulls circled above. Waves lapped at his feet. His once ambitious steps were now measured, peaceful. No stock reports. No conferences. Just footprints in wet sand. Guests came and went. Word spread, not through ads, but through stories. Stories of a man who left everything to build something with his hands. Of a woman who lost everything and grew it back stronger. Of two boys who smiled like the ocean. One family came all the way from the East Coast after reading a blog post about a place where kindness is currency. Sophie taught the mother how to cook halibut stew. Ethan showed the father how to cast a net. The kids played pirates with Liam and Chris, who now ran storytelling sessions in the garden. At night, the family sat by the fire pit, roasting fish and telling tales. Sometimes guests played guitar. Sometimes the wind sang its own song. Always, there was peace. Winter came slow, gentle, and quieter. Fewer guests. More time. Ethan spent those cold months writing something. Not for publishers. Not for profit. For his children. He wrote it by hand. In a leather-bound notebook Sophie gave him one Christmas. His story. The truth of who he had been. What he had lost. What he found again. Sometimes the best things don't come from how far you go, he wrote one night, but from having the courage to stay, to face what's yours, and to start over. He hoped one day the boys would read it and understand that their father wasn't always a good man, but he became one. One morning, Liam asked, "Dad, what's success?" Ethan paused, then looked out the window, where Chris and Benjamin were playing in the dirt. He smiled. "It's right there," he said, and meant it. The attic of the guest house wasn't much, just a slanted ceiling, a worn rug, and two chairs by the window. But to Ethan and Sophie, it was their sanctuary, their place. The children were asleep below. The sea whispered just beyond the glass. And tonight, the moon was impossibly bright, casting its silver light across the old floorboards like spilled milk. Sophie entered quietly, 2 mugs of chamomile tea in her hands. She handed Ethan one, then sank into the chair beside him. For a long time, they didn't speak. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was full, familiar. She stared out the window, her face lit by moonlight, then said, barely above a whisper, "Did you know I once loved you?" Ethan turned to her, startled, but she didn't look at him. Her eyes stayed fixed on the sea. "Back when I worked in your family's house," she continued, "I fell in love with you. I never said anything. I knew my place. I scrubbed floors. You dined with diplomats. But I used to watch the way you stood at the window. Always so quiet. Always looking out, like you wanted to be anywhere but where you were." Ethan swallowed hard. His voice caught somewhere in his throat. "I never knew. I didn't want you to." She smiled faintly. "It was safer to love you from a distance. But I did. And when your mother accused me of trying to seduce you, I wasn't angry because it was false. I was angry because I had hoped she was wrong. I had hoped you'd defend me." He set his tea down, turned fully toward her. "I've hated myself for that moment every day since." Her voice didn't tremble. "Not anymore. But you came back. And not just to say sorry. You stayed. You built a life here. Not for image. For us." She finally looked at him. And he saw it. The old wound that had healed not with time, but with love. "Sophie," he said, "I never stopped loving you. I just didn't know how to show it." He reached into the drawer beside the chair and pulled out a small velvet box. Opened it. No diamond. Just a simple silver band, engraved on the inside with 2 names, Sophie and Ethan. "I knelt once because I wanted to protect our family. But now I want to ask you again, not for the boys. Not for a court. But for us. For this. For love." He knelt on the old floor, the sea behind him, the woman in front of him. "Sophie Callahan," he said, "will you marry me again? This time, not for necessity, but because I love you. Fully. Grown. And forever." She didn't cry. She just smiled, nodded, and placed her hand in his. "Yes," she whispered. "And this time, I'm not hiding it." They didn't wake the children. They didn't call friends. They simply sat there, wrapped in moonlight and memory, holding hands like 2 people who had finally found home. 1 year later, on a golden afternoon, Ethan sat on the porch in a creaky wooden chair, Benjamin asleep in his arms. His hair was a mess. His shirt had baby spit on it, and he looked happier than he ever had in a $1,000 suit. Liam and Chris were building a sand fortress nearby, their laughter drifting up through the air like a hymn. Sophie emerged from the garden with her hands covered in soil, a bucket of herbs swinging by her side. She settled beside him, resting her head on his shoulder. "I don't see myself as just a maid anymore," she said softly. Ethan turned, kissed her temple. "You never were. You just hadn't been loved like someone worth everything." She closed her eyes, letting that truth settle. The sky turned amber. The wind carried the scent of rosemary and salt. The waves whispered along the shore, same as always. But in Ethan's chest, something was different. Still, whole. He wasn't a man who had conquered the world. He was a man who had lost everything worth keeping, and then earned it back. Not with power, with patience, with apology, with presence. In the farthest corner of Oregon's map, in a town without traffic lights, in a guest house made of driftwood and second chances, one old story had finally been rewritten. No boardrooms, no lawsuits, no legacy battles. Just a father rocking his son, a woman planting time, and the quiet knowledge that real success is measured not in numbers, but in love that stayed.